Let's talk about some terminology as far as shocks go and as far as Zebros Racing and Exit is concerned. There's some adjustments on all shocks. One of them that is going to be your go-to most all of the time first is your spring preload. And you're either going to have a threaded collar, or in this application we have some little grooves, and as you pull down on the spring you're able to move the clip. It's hidden right now. You'll be able to move the clip down to add more preload to your spring pack, and adding preload is going to affect your ride height, but also in a dual rate and a triple rate it's very sensitive to how much preload you put in. So if you put the shock on and you ride it and you're like, it feels a little bit soft and I would like a little bit more roll stability, by adding a couple of clips of preload to your front shocks, it can change the whole ride of the sled and change that roll stability. And in a dual rate application or a triple rate, which we talked about earlier, dual rate meaning it has two different springs and they're different rates and they're working in combination. Triple rate would mean that you would have three springs. You'd have a top tender, a middle tender, and then a mainspring. In this application on the Chaos, we found that our dual rate application works the best, and we're able to tune these springs with different rates based on the rider weight and also the type of terrain and the type of rider that they are. So if they're really aggressive, we can give them more rate and more bottoming resistance without really affecting the low speed ride quality by having a dual rate. So some of the other terminologies, you have the shock body, the shock shaft, your bump stop, which is down here at the bottom of the shaft, and then we call the end that is attached to the shaft the eyelet, and the other end that's attached to the body we always call the body cap insert, sometimes the body eyelet, so the body end eyelet. And then inside of the shock you have these little aluminum spacers. We call them reducers because basically all it's doing is reducing the size of the spherical bearing down to the correct bolt size. So 10 millimeter on the top and 8 millimeter on the bottom. So those reducers are two different sizes. And then we have the bridge and the external, the reservoir or the piggyback bridge with the compression clicker, and then if you have an X2 application there'll be a rebound clicker on the bottom. Those are some of the basic terms. There's also a free piston in here which we call an IFP, and that stands for internal floating piston. And then you have an end cap with your Schrader valve, and this just houses the nitrogen. That's nothing that you need to ever adjust. It's set when we assemble the shock, and because it's filled with nitrogen, that pressure will never change. It's an inert gas, so you don't ever need to mess with that. It's something we utilize only when we're servicing and bleeding the shock up and finish assembling the shock. So those are some of the terminologies you might hear. Spring retainer is going to be on both ends of the spring, and that's just what retains the spring and holds it onto the shock. There's a couple of different styles. There's some that slip on over the shaft, and then ours just utilize a little C-clip. I don't know if you can see it hidden behind there, but the advantage to this is you can run a very low spring rate or preload and not ever have to worry about this coming off, whereas with the C-shaped style that goes over the shaft, if the spring ever gets loose it can fall off. Your spring can fall off the bottom and then damage your front end. So that's one reason we utilize that. The other part would be your crossover divider, and so this divides the two springs, but it also has a given height inside the tender spring so that we can pick the crossover point of where we want to cross over from the tender spring to the mainspring at a given percentage of travel. Based on the length of that spacer in there, we can cross over to the mainspring, and that's another very important tuning feature. So those are some of the terminologies you might hear as you're talking about shocks.